Thanks very much for inviting me here to speak to you about Essex murders. Now, it's often been said that for the most interesting murder cases you should not look at big cities, but at little villages, sleepy market towns. And I believe that nowhere is this truer than in the county of Essex. I'm going to start by giving you some very brief details about some of the many cases that I have researched and written about. And then I'm going to look in more detail at 3 cases which have got connections to this area. So one case, for example, was the notorious smuggler Colchester Jack. Now, he was a very arrogant man. He believed that because he smuggled luxury goods for rich people, he could commit murder and get away with it. Well, he was very mistaken and came from a very sticky end indeed. A case in Dagenham. Cruel murder of a young policeman lured from his beat and quite gruesomely done to death. This case actually resulted in a national scandal for the Metropolitan Police. It's unsolved, still gives rise to controversy today. A Colchester case from 1893. Well, a man was murdered and the shop that he worked in was burnt down. There was really no mystery about who the murderer was, but he disappeared. Years went by, and then somebody said they'd seen him in New Zealand. So at huge expense, the police were sent, this took several weeks, across to New Zealand, where they found the man, arrested him and brought him back. And then they found they had the wrong person, which was extremely embarrassing for them. Now, I live in Walthamstow, and I always like to find a really quite a nice, juicy, historical case, preferably on my own doorstep. And in 1751, a harmless butcher called Joseph Jeffreys was shot to death in his own bed, and he was the victim of a plot. This was hatched by his niece Elizabeth. She was a young woman with an unfortunate taste for strong drink and weak men, and she had inveigled the servant to murder her uncle so she could inherit his money. And the deal was that she would then marry him afterwards, of course. But, well, of course, they didn't get away with it. But after the murder, someone built a scaffold in Walthamstow, just opposite where the murder had taken place, and thousands of people poured into Walthamstow to watch this execution, paying quite a lot of money, several shillings for a seat. And they waited quite some time before they realised that nothing had happened. And then they realised they'd all been duped, because actually the hanging had taken place somewhere else. And they demanded their money back, and didn't get it, so there was a bit of a riot then near the middle of Walthamstow. The murder, this is now in the Second World War. A taxi driver was murdered by 2 American servicemen, and this resulted in a simultaneous double court-martial, very unusual. And I actually wrote to the American Air Force for some information about this, and about 3 weeks before the book was due to come out, I received a large package marked confidential, saying, oh, you can have all these documents, which was great, and I had to rewrite the chapter at the last minute, but anyway, that did give me exclusive information. And then, having written Essex murders, I was asked to write more Essex murders. I wrote about a case in Widdington. This was in 1823. Ordinary sort of case, but what fascinated me about this one, no police, no detectives, no scene of crime officers, no, nothing like that, no CSIs, but the local people themselves put together all the clues that tracked the murderer just by looking and observing the clues that were on the ground, the bloodstains, the footprints. Surprisingly wonderful analysis of a crime scene as long ago as that. And then a case from Great Bromley, which I don't think anyone's ever written about before. An attractive 20-year-old girl, daughter of quite a well-to-do farmer, became obsessed by one of his labourers, who was unprepossessing gentleman of 49, married with 6 children. The repercussions of that obsession were pretty amazing. A case in Prittlewell, a scoundrel by the name of James Cannon Reed, married with 8 children, but still had the energy to chase after lots of other women, had at least 3 mistresses that we know of. 2 of them became pregnant, 1 of them he murdered. I can only say he got his just desserts eventually. And just recently, well, one of the most recent ones I've written about, from 1958, this is the murder of a Dutch au pair girl, which I'm hoping, because it's in living memory, this is an unsolved case, I'm hoping it jogs someone's memory when they read about it, and maybe we can get some resolution on it. Now, my research takes me to lots of interesting places. Muddy graveyards, muddy fields, muddy pathways, yes, muddy woods, all of that, yes, and pubs, because the inquests were held there, you see, so you have to go to the pub, but also because Gary drives me to all these places, I always like to think that he'll get a nice lunch at the end of it, you see. Well, now, every county, I think, has got a place which I think of as the murder capital of that county. Not where it's got the most murders often, but sometimes the most interesting ones. In the county of Essex, certainly in the 19th century, the murder capital was a tiny little village called Clavering, not all that far from here. And I'm going to tell you about a woman who I think is one of the most wicked women I have ever written about. The story begins in 1844. Now, Clavering, agricultural village, times were hard. People had to really struggle to get by, and there were lots of little tiny cottages, and some people couldn't even afford to have a whole cottage themselves. They used to divide them down the middle and get one family in one half and one family in the other. Now, the wealthy people, of course, they were the landowners, the farmers, they had the power of hiring and firing. So it was a brave person who crossed all of these people. Now, in Clavering, there was a farm called Curl's Farm where there lived a family called Newport. John Newport and his wife had several children, including a son called Thomas, who was 26. Right at the other end of the social scale, a little village called Manudon, a couple of miles away, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor and their 7 children lived in what the papers later described as a hovel, although it was quite well kept. And one of the Taylor daughters, 18-year-old Lydia, went to work as a maidservant at Curl's Farm for the Newport family. By the following summer, there were unmistakable signs that Lydia was pregnant. So naturally, of course, she was going to be fired from her job, wasn't she? And Mrs. Newport said, "Who's the father?" He said, "It's your son, Thomas." He wasn't very pleased, as you can imagine. Thomas was the sort of young man who believed he could do whatever he liked and use his money and position to wriggle out of it. I think we all know that sort. But he was unrepentant. He approached Lydia and he said, "Well, I think it would be better for everybody," by everybody meaning himself, "to get rid of the baby." She said no. He came back, he gave her some medicine, said, "Take it." I don't know what the medicine was. Anyway, she pushed him away, walked off. So she went back to Manudon. There was that little overcrowded hovel. She went to live with her family again, and eventually she gave birth to a healthy, bouncing baby boy called Solomon. So they naturally went to Thomas and asked him for some support money, and grudgingly he parted with a few shillings, but he wasn't happy. In 1846, Lydia received an unexpected visitor. This was a woman called Sarah Chesham. She hardly knew her. Sarah Chesham lived in Clavering, and she was the wife of a labourer there. And she came along and she made a huge fuss over the baby. What Lydia didn't know was that Sarah Chesham, handsome looking woman, had been having an affair with Thomas Newport.